Plants. You're familiar with their work. They turn all that carbon dioxide that we don't want into the oxygen that we do want. They're all around us, and they've been around for a lot longer than animals. The plants that we see today probably evolved from a single species of algae that nudged itself onshore about 1.2 billion years ago. And from that one little piece of algae, all of the 500,000 or so species of plants that we have today evolved. But of course, all this didn't happen overnight. It wasn't until about 475 million years ago that the first plants started to evolve, and they were very simple, didn't have a lot of different tissue types. And the descendants of those plants still live among us today. They're the non-vascular plants, the liverworts, the hornworts, and everybody's best friend, the mosses. Fuzzy. Now, yeah, it's clear that these guys are less complicated than an orchid or an oak tree, and if you said that they were, less beautiful, you probably wouldn't get that much argument from me. But by now, I think you've learned enough about biology to know that when it comes to the simplest things, sometimes they're the craziest of all. Because they evolved early in the scheme of things, they were sort of able to evolve their own set of rules, so much like we saw with archaea and protists and bacteria. Non-vascular plants have some bizarre features and some kooky habits that seem to us like just like, what? Usually when we're talking about plants, we're really talking about vascular plants, which have stuff like roots and stems and leaves. Those roots and stems and leaves are actually tissues that transport water and nutrients from one part of the plant to another. As a result, vascular plants are able to go all giant sequoia. The main defining trait of non-vascular plants is that they don't have specialized conductive tissues. Since they don't have roots and stems, they can't reach down into the soil to get water and nutrients. They have to take moisture in directly through their cell walls and move it around from cell to cell through osmosis, while they rely on diffusion to transport minerals. Another thing non-vascular plants have in common is limited growth potential, largely because they don't have tissues to move the good stuff around, or woody tissue to support more mass. The way for them to win is to keep it simple and small. So small that when you look at one of these dudes, you sometimes might not know what you're looking at. And finally, non-vascular plants need water for reproduction. This is kind of a bummer for them because it means that they can't really survive in dry places like a lot of vascular plants can. Other than that, non-vasculars are true plants. They're multicellular, they have cell walls made of cellulose, and they use photosynthesis to make their food.
What's up, guys? This is Mr. Mahmood, and welcome to the wonderful world of plants. Love them or hate them, you have to respect them, because without them, none of us would be here. They make the oxygen that allows all of the aerobic organisms on Earth to survive. So we really do have to appreciate them, and we've talked a little bit about them in a couple of the units already. In ecology, we used plants as reference a lot with our producers. In classification, it's a whole kingdom, right? One of the 6 kingdoms was plants, so we should already have some pretty good background on plants. So now let's get into a little more detail about the actual structure and categories of plants, so that we can get into a little further detail again in the second semester on exactly how they work. So in this discussion, we're basically going to cover the first half of the unit. In particular, we'll talk about non-vascular plants, which is what the intro guy was going into, what that means, and then particularly what vascular tissue is and the basic parts of a vascular plant. So we'll cover some of the intro and the basics from there in this first half of our lecture here that you guys are watching for the first lecture video. So let's get started. Basically, remember from the 6 kingdoms, you should know some basic things about them already, so let's review. First off, whether a plant is considered unicellular or multicellular. Now, you should remember from the 6 kingdoms, taxonomy and classification, there are 2 kingdoms that are 100% unicellular. Those are archaea and bacteria, right? And then there are 2 kingdoms that are 100% multicellular, meaning every single organism in that kingdom is made up of multiple cells, right? And those are the 2 most advanced kingdoms, which include Animalia and, you guessed it, plantae. So plantae would be considered multicellular because all plants have more than one cell. They're made up of more than one cell, and that's going to be very important when we start talking about why they're not algae and compare algae to the kingdom plantae and why we can't put them in the same kingdom. So all plants are multicellular, remember that. Whether they're prokaryotic or eukaryotic, again, you should remember at this point. I really hope you guys know the difference between the two. Pro, no, you do. Prokaryotic cells have no nucleus, have no organelles, they're very simple, very basic, and they're also considered to be among the oldest organisms on Earth, whereas eukaryotic cells are much more complex. They have a nucleus, they have organelles, much more advanced, and they're also thought to be younger, and they're much larger as well. So you should hopefully be able to tell me that the two prokaryotic kingdoms are archaea and bacteria, the same ones that I said are 100% unicellular, and then all of the remaining 4 kingdoms are eukaryotic. That includes protista, fungi, us as Animalia, and you guessed it, plantae. So plantae is also going to be considered eukaryotic. So all of the kingdom Plantae are multicellular eukaryotes, meaning they all have a nucleus, they all have organelles, and they're all made up of multiple cells. They do have a cell wall. Remember, 5 of the 6 kingdoms have cell walls. The only one that doesn't is Animalia. So particularly within the plant cells, their cell walls are made of something called cellulose, which you should remember. Cellulose is really just a long chain of sugars that we'll get into in more detail in the spring. But basically, it's the sugars that plants make. A lot of that sugar actually gets stored in their own cell wall, and that's what gives the cell wall such strength and rigidity. So that's what allows a plant to be real strong, real sturdy. It's basically functions kind of in a way sort of like the skeletal system within that cell, and then has a lot to do with the overall structure of the plant. So cellulose in its cell walls is very important for you guys to remember. And finally, the energy source that it uses is different from us. Remember, we're heterotrophs. That means we have to get our energy from other consumers, whereas plants are autotrophs. That means they can make their own food. They're self-feeding, and they can, in this case, always make their food through photosynthesis, which we'll again get into a little more detail in the spring semester. But they can make their own food using solar energy, using the sun, to take in that solar energy and make their own sugars from it that ultimately get stored, like we said before, in the cellulose of the cell walls and within the whole structure of the plant as well. So those sugars are the starting point of an ecosystem, and then the rest of the food chain pretty much just eats off of those sugars or other organisms that are eating those sugars. So plants are very important, like we talked about before. Basic structure of a plant cell. We haven't talked much about this in the past, so let's pay close attention to a few of the key parts of a plant cell. You should know most of this from middle school, but we have covered the nucleus. Remember, they're eukaryotes, so they have a nucleus. They also have organelles. That's what all these things are, with the exception of the dots. All those dots are ribosomes. That's something all cells have. We've talked about that in order to be able to assemble proteins, which every cell has to be able to do. All of the other things are considered organelles. Organelles are specialized structures that perform specialized functions within a cell. They allow cells to be more complex because they have a lot more going on, and each individual part has a very important role. They're very good at doing certain things, and so altogether, when all of the little parts do their job, then the whole process happens much more smoothly, right? So all the different components that you see here are called organelles. The ones I want you to pay close attention to are the chloroplast, which is where photosynthesis actually takes place. It's the chloroplasts that actually have a green color when you look at them. That makes most plants green, at least in the leaf and the stem section. The mitochondria is plural. Mitochondrion is one by itself. The mitochondria is where energy is actually made. All eukaryotic cells have mitochondria, including us. So we don't have chloroplasts, but we do have mitochondria to actually make our energy. So plants, just like us, have to take their food and make energy from it. They just have the luxury of making their own food, whereas we have to go find it. The cell membrane is something that all cells have. We've talked about that before. Cell membrane is something that all cells have in order to maintain a stable internal environment, or that homeostasis. If that cell membrane were to burst, like we said before, with the lytic cycle, that cell wouldn't be able to function. So the cell membrane is very important. The cell wall on the outside is what is made up of cellulose for plants and helps give it strength and structure. And then that big thing that you see there in the middle is called a vacuole. That vacuole is going to play a huge role in storing water for the plant, and within the plant cell, giving it a lot more of that strength and rigidity. So we're going to get back to that a little bit later throughout the unit. So just remember the basic parts of a plant cell. When we talk through the whole unit, we're going to eventually build up to what we consider the most advanced plants. Just like we mentioned in the 6 kingdoms, we think of certain kingdoms as the more basic ones, like bacteria and archaea, and then little by little, we think that different groups have evolved from the previous ones until you get to the most advanced ones that are the most recent ones, like plantae and animalia. So that cladogram you hopefully remember from from that unit. This one's a cladogram specifically within plants. So the theory is that the first plants were very simple, and they're still present today. Those plants are still alive, but over time, it's thought that other plants started developing that had very complex components above what was already there until we get to the most complex plants that are considered the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. We'll talk about that in the second lecture. We're going to focus in this lecture on the first few components there, the basic bryophytes like the mosses there, and an introduction to vascular tissue, and then go off from there. But you see in a cladogram, just like here, the things that are in the top, branching off at the top, are different groups of actual organisms, whereas the traits that you see along the bottom there are thought to have developed at that exact moment. So only the things that came to the right of it actually have the trait, the things to the left don't. So hopefully this picture will make more sense to you at the end of the unit, but this is just an introduction. We're going to focus in on the early plants and the development of that first very important trait, the vascular system, and what that really means for the plant. All right, so let's start with the early organisms. So the idea here is that all plants are thought to have originated from algae and other protists. So protists, the kingdom Protista, is thought to be significantly older than the kingdom Plantae. Now algae, if you ever look at it, looks like this green goo that's sitting in water. It's a lot of times the aquatic producers for those water ecosystems. So it's very easy to just say that algae are plants. In reality, they're not. And the major reason is because of one of those reviews that we talked about before. Even though algae is something that you can see, that looks like a lot, fairly large green goo, you don't need microscopes to be able to see the algae as a whole. The reality is each individual cell is its own organism. Algae does not actually combine to make tissues. You guys remember the levels of organization. The cells of algae are all individual. So algae are actually unicellular, but they can work with other unicellular algae as a group. And so we consider them what's called colonial, meaning that even though they're all unicellular, they can work together as a group and actually stay close together, or close enough that it looks like it's significantly larger. But they don't make up any sort of a tissue. They don't have any sort of advanced systems of transportation or things like that. Everything's within one cell to the next. So because algae is not considered multicellular, you can't consider it a plant, right? But it is thought that algae developed into the first species of plants, and then those plants developed into more advanced and more advanced until you get to the most advanced plants that we have available for us today. So the first category of plants that we're going to get into are thought to have developed from algae, in that they started out as unicellular that worked together, and then little by little they actually started forming components of tissues, and cells were so closely connected that they actually became the same organism, and little by little it developed into more advanced than just something we can say is a protist, and that developed into the kingdom Plantae. So the first plants are thought to have developed from algae. And again, algae is not considered a plant because algae is not multicellular. Algae are all unicellular, but they work together, which is considered colonial, and that's why you can see algae from close up without having to use a microscope, even though it's not actually multicellular working together. So remember those two basic components. So the first plants, the first category of what's thought to be the kingdom Plantae are the ones that are considered non-vascular plants, some of the stuff that they talked about in that intro video. These non-vascular plants are also referred to as bryophytes, or these early land plants. Now, the key characteristics about these bryophytes is that they don't have a way of transporting water and nutrients throughout the structure. So instead, just like the algae, which is all unicellular, they all kind of depend on just allowing things to move from one part of the cell to the next, just one by one in order to get anywhere it needs to go. These bryophytes are kind of the same way. Even though they do have components that are together enough to be considered tissues, there's not really any sort of a transport system to get things where they need to go. We, for example, as animals and as complex animals, we've talked about this in the last unit, we have a very efficient transport system in our body, which is our circulatory system. Transports hormones, waste, sugars, water, everything we need to get throughout the body goes through our circulatory system. So we're lucky in that way that things can move efficiently. If we're looking at these bryophytes, they don't have any sort of a transport system like that, and therefore they just depend on one cell taking things needed to push into another cell, then that cell pushes into the next cell, and then little by little, things like water can get absorbed and then slowly work its way through. That movement of water across the membrane is called osmosis. Osmosis is something, again, we'll get into in more detail in the second semester, but it's basically the movement of water from where there's a lot to where there's a little. Water and other molecules naturally want to go from where there's a lot to where there's a little. So these bryophytes get the water they need to all parts of the plant through the slow movement of water from one cell to the next. So if you have a lot of water that the plant's sitting in, that first cell right on the surface absorbs a lot of water, and then the next cell is able to get that water, and then the next cell is able to get that water, and then little by little the water is able to get up where it needs to go. So it should make sense to you that in order for these bryophytes to survive and be able to flourish, there are some basic characteristics that you need to know about them. One, they have to be close to water at all times because they depend on there being a whole lot of water outside, so little by little that water can work its way from one cell to the next until it eventually works all the way up through the whole cell structure of every part of that bryophyte. So one, it has to be very close to water. And second, think about it, you can't have a bryophyte that's maybe 30, 40 feet tall because obviously you're depending on water from going one cell to the next, and each cell is only, it's microscopic, so it would take forever for water to make its way up in something that large. There's no way it would be able to function that way. So bryophytes, in order to survive, not only have to be close to water, but they have to be very small. It's very important that bryophytes are very small because, again, they just depend on water moving from one cell to the next. They don't have the luxury of a transport system. Other plants do, and that's what we consider vascular tissue. Vascular tissue is that transport system that makes water able to travel through the plant and other things able to travel through the plant much more efficiently. Once you get that, then you start talking about a lot more variety in size and environment of the plants. But without vascular tissue like these bryophytes, they have to be surrounded by water, very, very close to it, and they have to be very, very small in order to allow water and nutrients to go just through that basic component of osmosis. So osmosis is movement of water from high to low across the membrane. If we're not talking about water, but we're talking about other things like salts, sugars, things like that, the movement of other particles from high concentration to low across the membrane is called diffusion. So the more general term is diffusion. So that's how plants get their nutrients, specifically bryophytes, from one cell to the next. Osmosis is how the water moves from one cell to the next. So bryophytes depend on osmosis and diffusion to get their nutrients and their water. And because of that, they have to be very small since it takes a very long process to go from one cell to the next. So bryophytes are small, they live in very moist environments. So because they don't have vascular tissue, technically, bryophytes aren't considered to have the three basic components of a vascular plant. And those three basic components are roots, stems, and leaves. So they have parts that look similar to roots. Those are called rhizoids. So if you hear the word rhizoid, you should connect that to bryophytes. They have things that are similar to a stem, and they have things that are similar to a leaf, but you can't actually call it root, stems, or leaves because by definition, those three things actually have vascular tissue. So bryophytes, three things that they do not have would be root, stems, and leaves because by definition, they don't have vascular tissue. So very important you have those basics and understood. So let's talk about vascular tissue, right, in relation to the other two types of tissue in the more advanced plants. The vascular tissue itself is what's able to transport water and nutrients through the cell. It becomes a much more efficient way of transportation. So once you deal with a plant that has that vascular tissue, you now have the ability for the plant to have two changes. One, it can live in an environment that's not completely submerged in water, right? All plants need water, but once you get vascular tissue, it doesn't have to be in a massive supply anymore. Just a little bit of water can do the trick to get all the way through the plant because the vascular tissue can help get it where it needs to go. A second key component is size. Once you have vascular tissue, a plant can be significantly taller because the water can travel much faster. It doesn't depend on just going from one cell to the next. It can actually kind of fire through the system. We'll talk a little bit about how it's able to do that as well. So that's the vascular tissue. In this case, it's the one labeled with the most purple, right? And it shows you 3 different cross sections of a plant. The one that you see on the bottom right represents the root component of that cross section. So you see a lot of the vascular tissue pretty well absorbed in the middle because the water is being brought in from the roots. We've talked about that with transpiration in the water cycle. Water gets absorbed from the roots to move up the plant, right? Then within the stem structure itself, you have the vascular tissue kind of slowly spreading its way out as you move up. And then once you get to the leaf, the extensions of the leaf, the little veins of the leaf, transport that water to get to the different parts that really go through the most photosynthesis. Now that photosynthesis itself and all the real work of the plant happens in the cells around the vascular tissue, which is actually called ground tissue. Don't ask me why it's called ground tissue, but please make sure you hear this. Ground tissue is not just in the ground. I'm not just talking about the tissue in the roots. Ground tissue is the middle part, or the part surrounding the vascular tissue, all the way through the plant. So there's ground tissue in the root, yes, there's ground tissue in the stem, and there's ground tissue in the leaf. It's just the part surrounding the vascular tissue that makes up the meat of the plant, basically. And then the outermost layer, kind of like the skin of that plant, is what we consider the dermal tissue. Dermal means skin, like a dermatologist is a skin doctor, right? Your epidermis is your skin. So dermal is just the outer skin layer of the actual plant. So the outer layer is called the dermal tissue. The transport system that transports water and nutrients is called the vascular tissue, and then everything else around it within the dermal layer is considered ground tissue. All right, so within that vascular tissue, there are 2 key parts and 2 types of vascular tissue. One of them transports water, the other transports the sugars that are made after photosynthesis. The one that transports water up the root, through the stem, and finally to the leaf so that photosynthesis can begin is called the xylem, X-Y-L-E-M. The xylem transports water to the leaf so that photosynthesis can begin. You should remember photosynthesis requires a few things. Besides water, it also needs carbon dioxide and a little bit of light energy. Once you get all 3 of those in the leaf of a plant, then you have the ability of going through photosynthesis, or the plant does. Once you have those 3. So water is one of the things needed to start photosynthesis. So the xylem transports water to the leaf. The phloem, P-H-L-O-E-M, transports the major product of photosynthesis, which is the sugar that they're able to make. A lot of times we use glucose as the example. Transports that sugar to the rest of the plant so that the cells can get the sugar they need. So within a plant, the leaf is where the most photosynthesis actually happens, but all cells in a plant require energy. So once the sugars are actually made in the leaf, kind of like the plant's factory for sugar, it's transported out to the rest of the plant so that they can get the sugar they need. So in a lot of ways, these tissue layers, specifically the xylem and the phloem, work a lot like our body systems. We just finished with the human body systems. We talked about a lot of the different ways that things are transported and structure is able to be maintained, and that all comes here as well, because that vascular tissue, when it's transporting water, it's very strong and it's very, I guess the word is taut, very well structured. It doesn't bend, it's not flimsy, it's not weak. If water is traveling through, it's like a water hose. Once you turn that water on, the hose becomes pretty rigid and pretty strong. When you turn it off, it becomes real flimsy. So when the vascular tissue has plenty of water traveling through it, it stays pretty rigid, it stays pretty strong. So that's a structural component. So that's a lot like our skeletal system. Our skeletal system gives us the structural support to keep our body upright. Plants work the same way. They need structural support to hold themselves up, but they're not made of bone, right? There's no bone in a plant. The strength in a plant comes from their water, and particularly that xylem that transports the water up a vascular plant. If it's full and there's plenty of water firing through, it's like a water hose that has a lot of water pressure firing through. That water hose becomes very strong. So the plant can keep its strength with a full xylem, basically, and it serves as sort of the structural component of the whole plant. So it's a lot like our skeletal system. At the same time, we said the xylem transports water to the leaf to start photosynthesis, whereas the phloem transports the sugars out of the leaf after photosynthesis. works a lot like our circulatory system. Our circulatory system, which you may not know, we didn't talk in too much detail about, but the circulatory system has arteries and veins. Okay? Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Veins bring blood to the heart. Most of that blood that's going away from the heart has a whole lot of oxygen. And the whole point of your circulatory system in terms of oxygen is to take all of that oxygen to your cells so that your cells can use it to start the process that makes our energy. So that's called respiration. Cells can go through respiration only when they get the oxygen they need. So your heart and circulatory system are a lot like the xylem and the phloem. The xylem is a lot like your arteries because most arteries carry oxygen to your cells to start respiration, just like the xylem carries water to the leaf to start photosynthesis. They both take something needed to start a major reaction. On the opposite side, the veins of your circulatory system are a lot like the phloem in that they take a major product away from where it took place for a couple of different reasons. For our case, the waste product that's made in respiration is carbon dioxide gas. That needs to be sent back to your heart, back to your lungs so you can get rid of it. So the veins, most veins, carry that carbon dioxide away from your cells so they can get rid of it. The phloem carries the sugars away from the leaf, not necessarily to get rid of them, but to make sure they get where they need to go, because all cells need the sugar, even though not all cells really make them. So the phloem transports a product of photosynthesis, just like the veins transport a product of respiration. So there's a very strong connection to the circulatory system, and that it gets things that are needed to start major reactions where they need to go, and then it takes things away as well, waste products or other products away from it. So you can make many connections circulatory and also to the skeletal system, particularly with that vascular tissue. Very important. All right, so we said before, once you have vascular tissue, then that means technically you have three key components of a plant. You have roots, stems, and leaves. Now within the roots category, there are a few different types of roots within the plant kingdom, and they're really all based on visual observation. You can pretty much look without any magnifying lens or anything like that at the roots of a plant and determine what type of roots it has. The first category are what we call fibrous roots. Fibrous roots have a lot of little tiny extensions that will help absorb water and nutrients. Now, we've talked about this with the human body system and structure and function, but a lot of times cells have a lot of little extensions, and those little extensions increase surface area so that whatever's happening on the surface, there can be a lot more of it. And that's exactly the case here with fibrous roots. You have a lot of little tiny extensions of roots. Each one of those little tiny extensions is able to absorb water and minerals from the soil, so it can go up the roots to the stems and to the leaf. So fibrous roots work pretty well in being able to absorb a lot of nutrients. It doesn't do a great job in giving real strong structural support for that plant. So a lot of the plants that have fibrous roots typically don't have very high stalks and aren't very tall. So usually when we talk about fibrous roots, we're talking about basic grasses and things like that. Grass is a good example of something that has fibrous roots. The second major category, or we consider taproots. A taproot is where there's one primary root. One large primary root. Now it's sort of a downside in that it doesn't have as much surface area in reference or comparison to the same amount of root in the fibrous roots because they all branch out. But that taproot is much stronger. So a lot of times taproots tend to be taller and there's a lot more structural support there. At the same time, taproots store a whole lot more sugar than fibrous roots because a lot of the excess sugar made in the leaf that's traveled through the phloem to the rest of the plant dissipates and stores in the roots. So if you have fibrous roots, there's not a whole lot of area to store sugar there. But a taproot, because it's so large, can store a pretty significant amount of sugar. So if you talk about which of the two is a better nutrient source or better food source for us, obviously the answer would be a taproot because there's a lot more stored sugar in a taproot. So a good example, like you see there, carrots, beets, turnips, things like that, are all good examples of taproots. A lot of sugar, a lot of nutrient source there because it's there as a storage, but it's also pretty good structural support for the plant. So fibrous roots have a lot of extensions. Taproots have one primary root that gives it much more structural support. The other two categories aren't very common, not nearly as common. Pretty much a lot of the plants can be broken down to either having fibrous or taproots. But there are two other examples I want you to know. One are called prop roots. Prop roots are basically roots that are in the ground and kind of work their way up. A perfect scenario for that, especially living in the area we live in, we're kind of in a booming economy, a booming area. Think of anywhere where you have new buildings coming up. A lot of times when there's a new building being built, they want to put new plant life around it. So if you ever see construction around an area where they plant a new tree, a smaller tree, a lot of times they won't just plant the tree and just hope for the best, right? Because the roots need some time to really grow underneath and give it a lot more strength. So at first, instead of just planting it and leaving it alone, they'll put a lot of these metal poles around it with some rope and tie it around the trunk of the tree from all different areas to give it a little more structural support so that the plant has long enough time to really develop those roots. So those extensions coming out that grab onto the tree and really keep it strong and keep it upright are very similar. That's the artificial way of the same thing in a natural process with prop roots. So if you see something that has roots that are in the ground but kind of have a part where they're above ground, those are what we consider prop roots. So prop roots, like you see there, one thing that prop roots can definitely allow for is really top-heavy plants. Things like corn husks, things that would typically be pretty easy to fall over, are able to stay upright, and for one reason, because they have prop roots to give it more structural support at the base. So prop roots are something you see occasionally. And then the other one are called aerial roots. An aerial root is a root where everything is actually rooted above the ground, typically rooting off of another plant. So if you have a plant growing off of another plant, like a tree, usually like a flower or something like that growing off of a tree, it's rooted in the actual tree, which is above ground. So if the roots are actually above ground in something else, that's called an aerial root. So just make sure you know the 4 basic types of roots, but particularly the 2 major ones, fibrous roots and tap roots. Fibrous roots have a lot of extensions that aren't very good for structural support, but are very good for absorbing water and nutrients because they have more surface area, compared to a taproot, which has less surface area for the amount of root that's available, but it's much more structurally sound and usually is able to hold a plant upright and in place a little bit better. All right, now let's get on past the roots. The stem itself, we'll talk more about the stems later, especially when we get into the 2 categories of plants that are called monocots and dicots and the difference between them. But let's now get into the leaf. Within the plant, the leaf is arguably the most important part because this is where the most photosynthesis can actually take place. Now look at this picture. I promise you, listen carefully, I promise you, you will see this diagram of a leaf or some form very close to this diagram in this test on the plant unit. You'll see it on the semester exam. You'll see it on the final exam again in the spring. You'll see it on the EOC, the STAR test that you guys are taking, the end of course exam, and any test in science that has any relation to plants for the rest of your life will have some reference of this diagram. This is very important. This is what we consider a cross section of a leaf. Now, one key thing I want to make sure you see, this is not one single cell. Okay, I'm not representing one cell here. I'm representing thousands of different cells all working together to represent this leaf. This leaf is actually what we consider an organ because it's composed of multiple different tissues. Each tissue is composed of multiple different cells. So the leaf is a very important organ part of the system that makes up the transportation of waters and sugars and everything else through the plant. So looking at this organ of a leaf, let's make sure we understand the basic parts. Now the top and bottom of a leaf are represented at the top by the letter A and at the bottom with a lot of the components there, letters G, F, E, and D. All of those represent the bottom layer. Now you can tell the difference between the top and bottom with a few key characteristics. The top layer usually has a clear coating to keep water from leaving, I used a pun there, from leaving the leaf or exiting the leaf from the top to try to conserve the amount of water that's inside. That top thin clear layer is called a cuticle. Okay, so a cuticle is usually at the top side of a leaf to try to keep water from evaporating and coming or transpiring out from the top. So the only way water is actually released from a plant is from underneath. And there's a major reason for that. A lot of times a leaf will be facing upward, so there's a lot more heat energy at the top. So heat naturally would make water evaporate. So if there was more ability of water going up from the top, then the plant would have a hard time controlling how much water it's losing. So the top layer is covered by a cuticle to try to prevent water loss from the top. So the only water that's really being lost is from the bottom where there's not nearly as much heat energy. A lot of times there's shade under here because the sun is from above. So it's a lot easier to control how much water a plant wants to actually have exit the leaf. when there's less heat energy. So the water exiting the leaf actually comes at the bottom of the leaf because there's less heat energy there. So you can tell which part of the leaf is the bottom by which part actually has these things that you see labeled as letter G, which are called guard cells, and the opening that occurs within the guard cells called a stomata. So all of those little structures and openings that allow for water to exit the leaf from the bottom side are called guard cells on the outside that open up to a stoma or stomata that would allow the water to exit that leaf. Okay, so we'll talk about the stomata and the guard cells in a little more detail in just a second, but that represents the bottom or the underside of the leaf, and it's part of that dermal tissue that we talked about. The dermal tissue is the outer layer that represents where the cuticle is on the top and where these guard cells are on the bottom. Within the middle section is what we call the ground tissue. That's where the actual processes take place. In particular, here in the leaf, this is where the most photosynthesis actually takes place. You have the middle section of that ground tissue is called mesophyll. Meso means middle. So the mesophyll is the middle section. This is also known as the ground tissue in the leaf. This is where all of your photosynthesis for a plant will take place. And then that tube of structure that you see the letter F there in the middle is then your vascular tissue. It's also known as a vascular bundle because it's carrying both vascular tissue types. It's carrying the xylem and the phloem, both of which are essential in order for photosynthesis to happen properly and get the products where they need to go. So basically, you have the xylem coming all the way from the roots up the stems and eventually here to the leaf. So it's bringing the water up from the roots out to the actual leaf. So the water is now being dispersed out in the mesophyll. So all of these cells here in the mesophyll can now actually go through photosynthesis because they have the water. The carbon dioxide actually comes in through those stomata on the underside, and then the sunlight, the solar energy, is being absorbed by what makes that plant green, and we're going to get more into that in the second semester. So it's getting everything it needs in order to go through photosynthesis here in the mesophyll. The two parts of the mesophyll, you see how it's labeled letter B and letter C. The letter B section is called the palisade mesophyll, and then the letter C is called the spongy mesophyll. The basics here, and you can't tell from the diagram, but it's more green towards the top because there's more solar energy from the top. So that solar energy is getting absorbed by the things that make them green, which are the chloroplasts. The middle part of the spongy mesophyll doesn't have quite as much of that pigment because it doesn't absorb quite as much energy. It's just one thing that plants have developed to evolve to be the most efficient. They absorb the most energy from the top. So you have the mesophyll there in the middle that absorbs solar energy. The vascular bundles bring in that water through the xylem to disperse into the mesophyll or into that ground tissue. And now photosynthesis can take place as long as carbon dioxide is coming up through those stomata. At the end of photosynthesis, the major products are the sugars and oxygen gas. The sugars are going to be sent back through the vascular bundles, through the phloem, to go to the rest of the plant so that the rest of the plant gets the sugars they need. Any excess sugar is going to go all the way down to the roots and be stored there. And if it's a taproot, that means there's a whole lot of nutrition there that somebody could use if they were feeding off of that. Then within the sugars being released, you also have oxygen gas that needs to be released out. And again, that's what the guard cells and stomata are used for. So the guard cells and the stomata play important roles, not just for releasing excess water, but also for allowing carbon dioxide in and oxygen out. So very important roles for the stomata. So please make sure you understand the basic diagram here, know all the parts of them, and please understand this is not one cell. This is representing a whole organ of the leaf and all the different tissues that play important roles within them. All right, so one major component is that water loss through the leaf. Now remember, water only goes in one direction. Water is brought up from the roots, up the stem, and eventually out through the leaf. You guys will learn a little bit about how water is actually able to go up against gravity, and there are a few basic components to that basically create sort of like a vacuum or a suction and enough pressure to get that water moving upward. So the only way water is actually released from a plant is through transpiration, which actually occurs in the leaf. So water exits out those stomata and is able to evaporate, and we've talked about that in the past as one way the water cycle is able to get water up into the atmosphere through that water loss from plants. Too much heat energy means that plants get dried out, and that's why plants die in the summer unless they get enough water, because the water is lost through those stomata. So one key thing to know here is water only goes out of a stomata. You don't have water coming in through a stomata. So any of you guys that have plants at home, if you're watering the leaves of a plant, you're not doing anything except making it look pretty because you're maybe washing off some of the dirt. If you really want that plant to get the water, water the root, water the soil that's right around the root. That's gonna allow the water to move up, because transpiration and water movement only goes in one direction. Water only exits through the stomata. All right? But then within the same stomata, besides just water exiting, you also have to worry about gas exchange. So carbon dioxide has to be able to come in to the leaf so photosynthesis can happen, and then the product of photosynthesis, which is oxygen, has to be able to exit. So the stomata is very, very important, and it's all about these guard cells. So here's the idea. Imagine the guard cells are like, what are those, like clown balloons? You know those clown balloons that are really long that you can like balloon animals out of? You kind of twist them around and make different things out of. Those are basically like your guard cells. So imagine you had two of those that you didn't blow any air into, so they're just flat. When they're flat, they're pretty much straight. So imagine guard cells, when they're flat and empty, as being pretty much straight. So when a guard cell doesn't have the ability of filling up with water, it stays flat and straight, which means it stays closed. Then little by little, as you fill up those guard cells, in this case with water, the guard cells start to bend a little bit, so they make that shape, sort of like the clown balloons. Those balloons kind of curve a little when they're filled up all the way. So it's the same thing with guard cells. As they fill up with water, they actually start to curve out a little bit and create a little opening inside. That opening is what we consider the stomata being open, or the stoma being open. So it's actually an ingenious way that plants have developed conservation of water. When a plant doesn't have much water, and therefore can't really afford to lose much, the stomata stay closed, which means the guard cells stay flat. Because if there's very little water, that means the guard cells don't fill up with water. There's no excess, so the water doesn't even make it to the guard cells to fill up. So because they're flat and they're empty, they stay close together and the stomata is closed, which means it's very hard to get water to exit that leaf, and it's conserved in the plant. On the opposite side, if there's a whole lot of excess water, a lot of rain, rainforest, something like that, water is moving all the way up through the leaf in excess, the guard cells fill up all the time. And as they fill up, they open. And when it's open, now a lot more water can release out and be transpired. So it's really an amazing way that plants have developed to conserve water when needed. So the guard cells stay flat when there's not much water. The guard cells don't fill up. But when water is plentiful, then the guard cells fill up like a balloon and open up the space inside so that water can be released out much more easily. So this is how plants are able to conserve water when they need it, and then get rid of any excess water when they don't. So stomata play a very important role in the transpiration, water releasing, but they also play an important role in gas exchange. So when those stomata are open, that's the time when gas exchange can really take place as well. So it's essential to get the carbon dioxide to start photosynthesis, and then the things that go out would be the oxygen that's the product of photosynthesis, as well as any excess water that the plant may have. Alright, so that's all we're going to cover this time. When we come back, we're going to talk more about the plants that have vascular tissue, and then the development of the most advanced plants and how they're able to pass on those same traits. So thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.